The late afternoon sun dipped low over the horizon, casting a warm, honeyed glow across the sprawling streets of Atlanta. Marcus Tate adjusted his tie in the rearview mirror of his sleek black SUV, the hum of the engine a steady companion after a grueling day at the office. At 42, Marcus carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who'd climbed mountains to get where he was, Director of Internal Affairs for the Atlanta Police Department. His sharp gray suit and silver cufflinks spoke of success, but his eyes, deep and thoughtful, held the weight of 1,000 unseen battles. He was on his way home to his wife, Aisha, and their 2 daughters, dreaming of the quiet evening ahead, maybe a glass of bourbon and a chance to read the novel he'd been neglecting. The radio murmured a jazz tune, the saxophone weaving through the air like a gentle breeze. Marcus tapped his fingers on the steering wheel, easing through the city's familiar grid. He was 2 blocks from home when the light ahead turned yellow. He slowed, letting the SUV coast to a stop as the signal flicked red. That's when the flashing lights erupted behind him, blue and red slicing through the golden dusk. Marcus frowned, glancing into his side mirror. A police cruiser pulled up tight behind him, its siren giving a single, sharp yelp before falling silent. He exhaled slowly, rolling down his window as the officer approached. The air carried the faint scent of exhaust and blooming magnolias, a strange juxtaposition to the tension creeping into his shoulders. Officer Daniel Hargrove stepped out of the cruiser, his boots thudding against the pavement. Mid-20s, with a crew cut and a jaw set like he was auditioning for a tough guy role, Hargrove adjusted his duty belt with a swagger that suggested he owned the street. His badge glinted in the fading light, a small beacon of authority. He leaned toward Marcus's window, his tone clipped and cold. "License and registration," Hargrove said, not bothering with pleasantries. Marcus nodded, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. He reached into the center console, retrieving his registration, then pulled his license from his wallet. "Here you go, officer," he said, his voice calm but firm, the kind of tone that invited respect without demanding it. Hargrove snatched the documents, his eyes flicking over them before settling on Marcus. "You know why I pulled you over?" "Not entirely," Marcus replied, meeting the officer's gaze. "I stopped at the light." "Was there something else?" "You rolled through it," Hargrove said, though his words sounded more like an accusation than a fact. "Almost caused an accident." Marcus's brow furrowed slightly. He'd been driving these streets for years, knew every intersection like the back of his hand. He hadn't rolled through anything. But he kept his tone even. "I see. I'll be more careful next time." Hargrove didn't respond right away. Instead, he straightened, his posture stiffening as he studied Marcus more closely. The air shifted, subtle but palpable. This wasn't about a traffic violation anymore. Hargrove's eyes narrowed, lingering on Marcus's suit, his SUV, the way he sat with quiet confidence. It was as if he were searching for something to pin on him, something to justify the stop beyond a fabricated infraction. "Where you coming from?" Hargrove asked, his voice taking on a harder edge. "Work," Marcus said simply. "Long day." "Yeah. Where's that?" Hargrove pressed, leaning closer, his tone laced with suspicion. "Downtown," Marcus replied, keeping it vague. He didn't owe this man his life story. Hargrove smirked faintly, folding Marcus's license into his palm. "You're not from around here, are you?" "I've lived in Atlanta for over a decade," Marcus said, his patience thinning but his voice steady. "My address is on the license." Hargrove glanced at it again, as if he hadn't bothered to read it the first time. "Right. Step out of the vehicle for me." Marcus's grip tightened on the steering wheel for a fraction of a second. "Is there a reason for that, officer?" "I said step out," Hargrove snapped, his hand resting near his holster. "Don't make this complicated." The threat hung heavy, unspoken but clear. Marcus weighed his options. He could argue, knew he had every right to, but he also knew how these encounters could spiral. With a slow breath, he opened the door and stepped onto the pavement. At 6 feet 2 inches, he towered over Hargrove, his broad frame filling out the tailored suit. But he kept his hands visible, his demeanor calm, even as Hargrove's eyes raked over him like he was a suspect in a lineup. "Hands on the hood," Hargrove ordered, gesturing toward the SUV. Marcus complied, placing his palms flat against the warm metal. "Am I under arrest?" "Just a precaution," Hargrove muttered, stepping closer. "We've had some trouble in this area. Can't be too careful." "Trouble with men driving home from work?" Marcus asked, his tone neutral but pointed. Hargrove's jaw clenched, his hands moving quickly as he patted Marcus down. The search was rough, invasive, more about power than procedure. Marcus didn't flinch, didn't give Hargrove the reaction he seemed to crave. When the officer stepped back, his frustration was palpable. "You're clean," Hargrove said, almost disappointed. "Of course I am," Marcus replied, turning to face him. "Now, if we're done." "We're not done," Hargrove cut in, his voice rising. "You got a real attitude, you know that? Like you think you're above this." Marcus folded his arms, his gaze steady. "I don't think I'm above anything, officer. I just expect to be treated with the same respect I've shown you." Hargrove bristled, stepping into Marcus's space. "Respect? You think this is about respect? People like you." He stopped himself, the words dangling like a live wire. Marcus's expression didn't change, but his eyes sharpened. "People like me," he repeated softly, letting the phrase hang there, heavy with implication. Hargrove backpedaled, his confidence faltering. "You know what I mean," he muttered, though he didn't sound sure anymore. "I think I do," Marcus said, his voice low but cutting. "And I think we both know this isn't about a traffic light." The silence stretched, electric and tense. Hargrove's hand twitched near his belt, his bravado crumbling under Marcus's unshakable calm. He'd misjudged this stop, and he was starting to realize it. But Marcus wasn't finished, not by a long shot. This was just the beginning of a reckoning Hargrove couldn't see coming. Hargrove paced a tight circle in front of the SUV, his boots scuffing the asphalt. The sun had dipped lower, painting the sky with streaks of violet and orange, but the air crackled with the tension between the two men. Marcus stood still, his arms crossed, watching the officer unravel. Hargrove's bravado was fading, replaced by a jittery energy that betrayed his unease. "You think you're smart, huh?" Hargrove said, his voice tight. "Talking back like you run the show." "I'm not talking back," Marcus replied evenly. "I'm asking for clarity. That's all." Hargrove scoffed, but the sound was hollow. He tapped his fingers against his holster, a nervous tick. "Turn around. I need to check you again." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "You just did. What are you looking for this time?" Hargrove's face reddened. "I don't need to explain myself to you. Turn around." Marcus didn't move. "Officer, I've complied with everything you've asked. If there's no reason for this, I'd like to get back in my car and go home." The words landed like a challenge, and Hargrove's temper flared. "You don't tell me what to do. I tell you. Now turn around, or I'll." "You'll what?" Marcus interrupted, his tone still calm but edged with steel. "Escalate this further? Based on what?" Hargrove froze, his hand hovering near his radio. He was in deep now, and he knew it. But instead of backing down, he doubled down. "You're under suspicion. That's all I need." "Suspicion of what?" Marcus pressed, taking a small step forward. "You haven't said." "No ticket, no citation, just suspicion." Hargrove's eyes darted to the SUV, then back to Marcus. "I don't like your tone. And I don't like being profiled," Marcus shot back, his voice rising just enough to cut through the evening air. "So let's stop pretending. Tell me what this is really about." The accusation hung there, raw and undeniable. Hargrove's composure cracked, his lips parting as if to argue, but no words came. Marcus seized the moment. "Enough," he said, reaching into his jacket pocket. "I'm going to show you something, officer." "Stay calm, I'm just getting my badge." Hargrove's hand jerked toward his holster, but he stopped short as Marcus pulled out a leather wallet and flipped it open. The badge gleamed in the dim light, gold and authoritative. Hargrove's eyes widened, his breath catching. "Marcus Tate," Marcus said, his voice steady as granite. "Director of Internal Affairs, Atlanta PD." The words hit Hargrove like a freight train. He stumbled back a step, his face draining of color. "Internal Affairs?" he stammered, his bravado evaporating. "That's right," Marcus said, stepping closer. "I oversee officer conduct. Every stop, every search, every word, it all falls under my purview. Including this." Hargrove stared at the badge, then at Marcus, as if hoping it was a bluff. But the truth was undeniable. Marcus's calm wasn't weakness, it was power, restrained and deliberate. "You didn't know who you were stopping," Marcus continued, his tone measured but piercing. "And that's the problem. You assumed I was someone you could intimidate, someone who didn't matter." "Why?" Hargrove opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Marcus didn't let up. "Because of how I look?" he asked, his voice low and unrelenting. "Because I don't fit your idea of who deserves respect. That's not just a mistake, officer, it's a failure. And it's one I can't ignore." Hargrove's hands trembled as he handed back Marcus's license and registration. I didn't mean." "You did," Marcus cut in, taking the documents. "And that's why we're not done here. You'll hear from me again, not as a driver, but as the man who decides if you're fit to wear that uniform." Hargrove stood rooted to the spot, his world tilting. Marcus slid back into his SUV, the engine purring to life. As he pulled away, he glanced in the rearview mirror. Hargrove was still standing there, a silhouette against the fading light, his confidence shattered. The next morning, Marcus sat at his desk in the Internal Affairs office, a modern space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Atlanta. Files were stacked neatly before him, but his focus was on one in particular, Officer Daniel Hargrove. The record wasn't clean, complaints of aggressive behavior, questionable stops, brushed off as misunderstandings. Marcus leaned back, steepling his fingers. This wasn't just about Hargrove. It was about the system that let him thrive. A knock interrupted his thoughts. His assistant, Jamal, poked his head in. "Morning, Director. Chief Reynolds wants you at the briefing in an hour." "Thanks, Jamal," Marcus said, his mind already racing. "Schedule a one-on-one with her afterward. We've got work to do." Jamal nodded and slipped out. Marcus turned back to Hargrove's file, but his thoughts drifted to the bigger picture. He'd seen officers like Hargrove before, young, brash, shaped by a culture that rewarded unchecked power. Changing that culture was why he'd taken this job, why he'd fought tooth and nail to rise through the ranks. An hour later, Marcus stood before a room of senior officers, Chief Reynolds at his side. She was a no-nonsense woman, her gray hair pulled tight, her eyes sharp. The briefing was routine, until Marcus took the floor. "Last night," he began, his voice carrying across the room, "I was stopped by one of our own. No ticket, no cause, just suspicion. Officer Daniel Hargrove assumed I was a threat, not because of what I did, but because of who he thought I was." The room went silent, tension rippling through the air. Marcus recounted the stop, sparing no detail. When he finished, Chief Reynolds's jaw was tight. "This isn't isolated," Marcus said. "It's systemic. And it stops now." After the briefing, he met Reynolds in her office. She leaned back, studying him. "You're stirring the pot, Tate." "It needs stirring," he replied. "Hargrove's not the problem, he's the symptom. We've got a culture issue, and it starts with accountability." Reynolds sighed. "What's your move?" "A full review," Marcus said. "Training, oversight, consequences. Hargrove's on notice, disciplinary hearing next week. But this goes beyond him. We rebuild trust, or we lose it all." She nodded slowly. "You've got my backing. Don't pull punches." Marcus left the meeting with a fire in his chest. This was his moment, not just to correct Hargrove, but to reshape the department. The ripple effect was beginning. A week later, Hargrove sat across from Marcus in a stark hearing room, his uniform crisp but his eyes weary. The disciplinary panel, Marcus, Reynolds, and two others, listened as Hargrove recounted the stop, his voice halting. "I misjudged the situation," he admitted, avoiding Marcus's gaze. "I didn't know who he was." "That's the point," Marcus said, leaning forward. "You shouldn't have to know. Every person you stop deserves the same respect, the same fairness. You failed that." Hargrove flinched, but Marcus's tone softened. "This isn't the end for you, yet. 6 months probation, mandatory retraining. Show me you can change, and you keep the badge." Hargrove nodded, a mix of relief and shame crossing his face. As he left, Marcus felt the weight of the moment. It wasn't just about punishment, it was about redemption. Months later, the department was transforming. New policies rolled out, training intensified, and complaints dropped. Hargrove, to Marcus's surprise, excelled in retraining, his attitude shifting. One day, he approached Marcus outside the precinct. "I was wrong," Hargrove said, his voice steady. "I get it now. Thank you, for giving me a chance." Marcus smiled faintly. "You earned it. Keep proving it." As Hargrove walked away, Marcus looked out over the city. The sun was rising, casting gold across Atlanta. This was his legacy, not just a badge, but a promise, to hold power accountable, to lift others up, and to turn moments of conflict into catalysts for change.